This week on Perspective, the excruciating politics of Brexit. Britons are preparing themselves for a march off the Brexit cliff. Deal or no deal? No matter that leaders of the European Union have now offered up an extension. That extension requires the British Parliament to make another historic decision on the withdrawal agreement this coming week. It's been almost 3 years since Britons voted to leave the European Union, and ever since, the debate about Brexit has become increasingly rancorous. A debate that has drawn even deeper divisions among the British people, damaged friendships, split families, and slowed the economy.
So who is downright reckless here, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister ploughing on with an unachievable, unsupported deal.
The British government, once regarded as well-run, pragmatic, a diplomatic world leader, is now seen as incoherent, chaotic, playing a dangerous game of political brinksmanship.
This House has indulged itself on Europe for too long.
Order. There's a lot of very noisy barracking. What the Prime Minister is saying must be heard.
It's time for this House to determine that it will deliver on Brexit for the British people. That's what the British people deserve. They deserve better than this House has given them so far.
It was a desperate and battered Prime Minister who went back to the European Union to ask for a reprieve. An extension is but a short reprieve. The turmoil and uncertainty remain. On the program this week, a look at the political chaos in Britain. We'll get some perspective from the demonstrations in the streets of London this weekend. We'll look ahead at what to watch for in the coming days. But we begin in Brussels with the details of the EU's decision to extend the Brexit deadline. David Herszenhorn is the chief Brussels correspondent for POLITICO Europe. The European Union leadership has talked about how much patience this process has required. To the extent that you can, take us inside that room where they were debating what to do. What was the atmosphere like?
Well, there were times when it got heated. It wasn't very acrimonious, but they really had to figure out how hard to push back on the UK in the face of what's been persistent and continuing uncertainty for the last 2 years, essentially. The UK is clearly not ready to leave the European Union. Theresa May hasn't been able to cobble together a majority in the British Parliament for the deal that she reached with the European Union back in November. And so the question for some of them was how much more patience to have. Some taking a harder line, like French President Emmanuel Macron, saying that there may come a moment when the EU just has to push, has to accept that there may be a disorderly no-deal Brexit, what's known as going over the cliff edge. But others much more prudent, like Angela Merkel, whose tolerance for risk seems to be substantially lower, kind of reprimanding those folks, saying, look, there's no need for that. It's the worst possible outcome. There are some objective reasons to believe she's right. I mean, from the EU's perspective, strategic patience pays clear and convincing dividends to the tune of 10 to 12 billion euro per year into its budget as long as this process goes on. So even if a no-deal scenario were to come about down the line, a no-deal scenario later rather than sooner seems to have benefits. There's some arguments that creates a lot of confusion, indecision, that the UK could be a troublemaker going forward. But overall, the tendency seems to be away from any kind of risk of a catastrophic no-deal scenario and waiting this out. They've set this now, what I'm calling a two-date solution, where she has one last chance to save her deal and save her job, essentially trying to get this withdrawal agreement through the House of Commons, maybe with one or more additional votes. And then if she's able to do that, she'll have until May 22nd to finish up the details. If she fails to do that, then the UK as a whole has until April 12th to figure out what it wants to do and come back to the EU leaders to tell them, do they want a longer extension, months, perhaps more than a year, to really give time for a national election, maybe even a second referendum. But they are the ones who have to come back and tell the EU, here's what they want, here's what they're thinking, because so far the EU leaders have not been able to get clarity from Theresa May on that.
How do they view Theresa May, given how long this has taken and the kind of difficulty that's there?
There is some sympathy for Theresa May, but that sympathy has dissipated over the months. I mean, initially they were standing by her, trying to work with her, viewing her as their best possible partner in arranging an orderly exit of the UK from the EU. At this point, her credibility is shot. I mean, she's had to go back on so many different things that she said or promised, from when the first vote would take place in the UK Parliament on the deal, postponing that after saying for weeks that it would go forward. The biggest one now being that the UK would leave on time on March 29th. We know that's not the case. That March 29th deadline has now been scrapped at her request. She asked the EU leaders for June 30th. They said no way to that. She wasn't able to give them a good explanation for why they should push it out that far, why they should risk the potential complications it would create for the EU elections set to take place in May. So when it comes to Theresa May, there is just no confidence that she's still got control over the political situation in her country, that she has any ability to muster a majority in the House of Commons. They asked her this repeatedly. You know, what will she do differently to get this withdrawal agreement through after it has been rejected twice before? She didn't have a clear answer for that.
You know, it's interesting because there has been also a suggestion that, in fact, she was prepared to walk into that meeting and accept a no-deal outcome, but perhaps with the idea in her mind politically that the EU would wear it.
You know, this is really astonishing because, in fact, the one thing that the House of Commons has had a majority in support of is ruling out the no-deal scenario. So in keeping that option open, she was essentially defying her own parliament. Now, that's not legally binding, but the parliament position was clear. They do not want to see a no-deal scenario. The EU obviously doesn't want to see that, and they don't believe, actually, that she means that she in any way wants to see a no-deal outcome. She was obviously trying to maintain some leverage in these discussions to come in looking tough and talking tough. I think for some of the EU leaders, it made her seem a bit unhinged and more unreliable because they know this is not, in fact, what she's seeking. I mean, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, her own top economic advisors have warned about the potentially catastrophic effects. The EU is confident that it would be disastrous for everyone. The EU would not be immune to the economic impact of a no-deal Brexit, especially countries that are closer into the UK that have the increased economic ties, France, the Netherlands, Denmark. But they're sure, very confident, that the UK will hurt more. And so in that sense, there's not a lot of fear on their part that the UK would want a no-deal outcome. There is a lot of fear that political circumstances could unfold in an unpredictable way so that in effect you have an inadvertent no-deal outcome. But right now they've been able to agree on postponing the date. She accepted that deal. It gives her this new window until at least April 12th to put a plan together. And if not, they're hoping the UK will come back with another request.
David, thank you very much for this.
Sure, great to be with you.